She was fine an hour ago, laughing, talking, present. And then something shifted. You're not sure what. Maybe you said something. Maybe you didn't say enough. Maybe nothing happened at all. At least, nothing you can identify. But now she's quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of two people at peace. The other kind. The kind that fills the room like weather. The kind where every word you try feels wrong before it leaves your mouth, and the silence just keeps growing. Most people respond to this in one of two ways. They either push, asking over and over what's wrong until the silence turns into an argument, or they pull back, deciding she'll talk when she's ready and leaving her alone in something she was never asking to carry by herself. Both responses miss what's actually happening, because what looks like withdrawal is rarely withdrawal at all, and what feels like punishment is almost never about punishing you. Cognitive psychology, attachment science, and 2 decades of research into female emotional processing have produced a body of evidence that most people in relationships have never been told. The silence isn't emptiness. It is one of the most complex forms of communication the human brain produces, and learning to read it, really read it, will change every relationship you have for the rest of your life. Let's start at the beginning, because before we can understand why she goes quiet, we need to understand what silence actually is inside the brain of someone who loves you. 1. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is a different language entirely. In 1967, psychologist Albert Mehrabian published research that would become one of the most cited findings in communication science. His work suggested that the vast majority of emotional communication happens not through words, but through tone, expression, and body language. Words, he found, carry surprisingly little of what we actually mean to each other. But what happens when even tone and expression get withdrawn, when the face goes neutral and the voice goes silent? Most people interpret this as a message being withheld. What neuroscience shows is something far more nuanced. Silence, particularly in the context of emotional relationships, is not the absence of a message. It is a message with a different grammar. Researchers at the University of Amsterdam studying emotional regulation found that deliberate silence, the kind chosen rather than fallen into, activates the same neural pathways as complex verbal processing. The person who has gone quiet is not thinking less. In many cases, they are thinking more, processing more, feeling more. The silence is where the volume is highest. Your girlfriend going quiet is not her shutting down the conversation. In most cases, it is her having the conversation entirely inside herself, because something in her environment has told her, consciously or not, that the external version isn't safe yet. Understanding that is the first shift, and everything else builds from here, too. The female brain, under emotional stress, does something specific, and silence is part of it. Here is where the neuroscience becomes impossible to ignore. In 2002, researchers at UCLA, led by Dr. Shelley Taylor, published a landmark paper proposing what they called the tend and befriend response pattern, a stress response pattern that had been largely overlooked in psychology because most stress research had been conducted on male subjects. For decades, the dominant model of stress response was fight or flight. Threat appears, body mobilizes. You either confront or escape. And that model is real and well documented. But Dr. Taylor's team found that under emotional stress, women showed a markedly different neurological pattern. Rather than mobilizing outward, the female stress response more consistently oriented inward and relational toward processing, tending to connections, and seeking or protecting emotional safety. The neurochemistry behind this is specific. Under stress, the female brain releases higher levels of oxytocin than the male brain, the same bonding neurochemical we discussed in the context of attachment, and oxytocin, rather than amplifying the fight or flight response, actually dampens it. It orients the brain toward connection, toward reading the emotional environment, toward caution before action. What this means practically is this. When your girlfriend faces emotional stress inside the relationship, a moment of hurt, confusion, unmet need, or fear, her brain's first instinct is not to explode outward. It is to go inward, to process, to assess the emotional safety of the environment before deciding what to do next. The silence is not the problem. The silence is her nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. And here is the part that matters most. What determines whether she eventually comes out of that silence, whether the processing leads back to connection or deeper into withdrawal, is almost entirely determined by what the emotional environment around her feels like while she's in it. 3. There are 5 different silences, and they mean completely different things. The first silence is the processing silence. This is the most common and the least alarming. Something happened, a conversation, a moment, something she observed or felt, and her brain is working through it. She hasn't arrived at a conclusion yet. She doesn't have words yet because the thoughts haven't finished forming. This silence isn't about you. It's about her relationship with what just happened. The worst thing you can do in a processing silence is demand resolution before she's reached one. The best thing you can do is make the space feel safe enough for her to keep processing without the added pressure of managing your anxiety about her silence. The second silence is the protective silence. This one is about safety, specifically emotional safety. Something in the interaction has triggered her nervous system into a state of caution. Maybe something you said landed in a way you didn't intend. Maybe a pattern she's noticed repeated itself. Maybe she detected something in your tone that told her the environment isn't safe for honesty right now. Researcher Dr. John Gottman at the University of Washington spent over 4 decades studying couples in conflict. One of his most significant findings was that emotional withdrawal, what he called stonewalling, almost always emerges not from coldness but from flooding. When the nervous system becomes so overwhelmed by emotional input that it cannot regulate, the brain's protective response is to shut the channel down. She isn't closing you out, she is trying not to drown. The third silence is the grief silence. This is perhaps the most misread of all. When something has genuinely hurt her, not angered her, not frustrated her, but wounded something tender, she often goes quiet not because she's preparing an argument, but because she is grieving. Grief doesn't always announce itself with tears and visible pain. Sometimes it retreats. Sometimes it sits in stillness and processes loss, the loss of a moment, a feeling of safety, a version of the relationship she needed to believe in. This silence has a different quality than the others. It is softer, more still, and if you pay attention, you can feel the weight of it. The fourth silence is the exhaustion silence. Relationship researchers studying emotional labor, the invisible work of managing feelings, maintaining connection, and navigating emotional complexity in intimate relationships, have consistently found that this labor falls disproportionately on women. Dr. Arlie Hochschild at UC Berkeley, who coined the term emotional labor in 1983, found in her research that women spend significantly more cognitive and emotional energy monitoring the emotional temperature of their relationships than their male partners. Sometimes she goes quiet not because something just happened, but because she is tired of explaining, tired of initiating the conversations, tired of being the one who notices. This silence is not a withdrawal from you. It is a collapse into herself, a desperate, necessary pause from the relentlessness of feeling everything so deeply all the time. The fifth silence is the deciding silence. This is the one that partners most need to understand and most frequently fail to understand. Sometimes when she goes quiet, she is at a crossroads. Something has happened that has raised a question she hasn't answered yet. A question about the relationship, about you, about herself, about what she wants or needs or can continue to accept. She isn't punishing you, she is deciding something, and the decision she makes during this silence will often shape the relationship in ways that only become visible much later. What determines the outcome of a deciding silence is not what you say to break it, it is the pattern of everything that came before it. 4. What she needs during silence and what makes it worse. Research by Dr. Sue Johnson at the University of Ottawa, the founder of emotionally focused therapy and one of the most influential relationship scientists of the last 3 decades, produced a finding that reframes almost everything we understand about conflict and withdrawal in intimate relationships. What she found, studying hundreds of couples in distress, was the surface behavior, the silence, the withdrawal, the emotional distance, almost always masked an underlying attachment cry. Beneath the quiet was not coldness but need, not indifference but fear. The question underneath almost every silence in an intimate relationship, she found, is some version of the same thing. Are you there? Do I matter to you? Am I safe with you? The tragedy is that the silence, which is actually a bid for reassurance, so often gets interpreted as rejection, which causes the partner to either push harder, escalating her nervous system further, or pull back entirely, which confirms the exact fear that drove the silence in the first place. The cycle feeds itself. So what actually helps? The research is surprisingly specific. Studies on emotional co-regulation in couples found that the single most effective response to a partner's emotional withdrawal is not problem-solving, not questioning, and not giving space in the cold, distancing sense of the word. It is what researchers call a non-anxious presence, being emotionally available without being emotionally demanding, staying close without requiring her to perform readiness she doesn't yet have. In practical terms, this looks like this: a gentle acknowledgement that you notice something is different, not interrogation, acknowledgement. One sentence that communicates you are not going anywhere and you are not angry, and then the willingness to exist beside her in the discomfort without turning her silence into a problem she has to solve for you. This is harder than it sounds, because silence in someone you love activates your own attachment system. It feels like rejection, it feels like distance. Your own nervous system reads it as threat and mobilizes accordingly, pushing you toward exactly the behaviors that make her silence deeper. The couples who navigate this well are not the ones who feel less. They are the ones who have learned to regulate their own response to her silence long enough to stay present inside it. 5. The words she couldn't say and why she couldn't say them. Here is something that lives at the heart of this entire conversation and almost never gets said directly. When she goes quiet, it is not always because she doesn't know what she's feeling. Often she knows exactly what she's feeling. She goes quiet because she doesn't believe it will land safely. Researchers at Harvard studying emotional disclosure in intimate relationships found a pattern they called anticipated invalidation, the expectation, based on past experience, that expressing a particular feeling will result in dismissal, minimization, or conflict escalation. When this expectation exists, people, and women in particular, given the social conditioning around female emotion, learn to silence themselves preemptively, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned, through accumulated experience, that saying it costs more than silence does. Think about that. Every time a feeling she expressed was met with, "You're being too sensitive," every time she tried to explain something and it turned into a debate about whether her feeling was valid, every time she said she was hurt and the conversation shifted to defending the behavior that hurt her, each of those moments deposited something into a ledger her nervous system keeps quietly and accurately, and at some point the ledger tips and the silence begins. This is not manipulation, this is self-protection, and recognizing it as self-protection rather than emotional warfare is the single most important reframe in understanding why she goes quiet. Psychologist Dr. Brené Brown, whose research on vulnerability and shame has reached millions, describes this dynamic with precision. Vulnerability, she found, requires the perception of safety, not the guarantee of a perfect outcome, just the reasonable belief that the space is safe enough to try. When that belief erodes, the silence isn't a choice, it's a conclusion. 6. When silence becomes a pattern, what the research says. There is a difference between the silence that comes and goes as part of the natural rhythm of intimacy, the processing, the recovering, the returning, and the silence that settles in as a permanent weather system. Understanding the difference is critical because one is healthy and one is a signal. Dr. Gottman's research on relationship longevity identified 4 behavioral patterns he called the 4 horsemen, the most reliable predictors of relationship breakdown. One of them is contempt, one is defensiveness, one is criticism, but the 4th, and the one he found most predictive of eventual separation, is stonewalling, the sustained emotional withdrawal, the silence that stops being a pause and becomes a position. What his data showed was this: stonewalling doesn't usually begin as a choice, it begins as a response, the nervous system's last resort when flooding becomes a chronic state. But over time, if the underlying conditions don't change, it can calcify. The protective silence becomes the default silence, and eventually the silence stops being about protecting the relationship and starts being about protecting herself from it. The warning sign to watch for is not that she goes quiet, it is whether she comes back, whether the silence, however long, eventually opens again, whether she still reaches for connection, even imperfectly, even tentatively, with words that don't quite say the thing she means. As long as she is still reaching, the door is still open. When the reaching stops entirely, when the silence stops being charged but simply empty, that is when the research says urgent, honest attention is needed, not to fix the silence, to understand what the silence has been trying to say all along and what was never answered. 7. What she is actually saying. Translated. Let's make this concrete. Because all of this science, all of this research, all of this framework means nothing if it doesn't translate into something you can actually use in the real moments when the quiet falls. When she goes quiet after a conversation, she is often saying, "I heard something in what you said that I'm not sure how to process yet. Give me time and don't make me rush." When she goes quiet during a conflict, she is often saying, "My nervous system is overwhelmed right now. I need to feel safe before I can be honest. Pushing me harder will not open me up. It will shut me further down." When she goes quiet after you've let her down, she is often saying, "I'm grieving something, not because I want to punish you, because something that mattered to me got hurt, and grief needs space, not solutions." When she goes quiet and you can feel the distance even in the same room, she is often saying, "I've been trying to tell you something for a while and I haven't felt heard." The silence is what happens when words stop working. When she goes quiet and it feels different from all the other times, softer, more still, somehow final, she might be saying, "I'm deciding something, and what you do right now, how present you are, how safe this feels, is part of what I'm deciding with." None of these translations require perfection. They don't require you to get it right every time. They require something simpler and harder than that. They require you to stay curious about her silence instead of defensive about it, to treat it as a communication instead of an accusation, to ask not "what did I do wrong," but "what does she need that she doesn't yet know how to ask for?"